Revolution has come.
Revolution knows no compromise. Revolution overturns and destroys everything that gets in its way.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
You are watching Breakthrough News, and this is the Freedom Side. I'm one of your hosts, Eugene Puryear, here as always, alongside my intrepid co-host, Rania Khalek. Rania, great to be back alongside you after a week away.
It's great to be back alongside you, Eugene. And for those who watched last week, I want to reassure you we haven't offed K. He still exists. He just isn't on the program.
Wow,
right now.
I go away for 1 week and it gets pretty morbid and pretty dark here, but nonetheless, Kay,
Well,
yes.
we took a
still
poll
alive.
at the end of the show. So we took a poll at the end of the show to see whether we should cancel K or not, or kill him off. And so people didn't want to kill him off. So I
Great.
appreciate that our audience likes our staff.
Excellent. I'm also a K fan, so I'm glad he made it. Glad he cleared that bar. Nonetheless, happy to be here with everyone as always. And I will just remind those of you who are watching on YouTube, now would be as good a time as any to go ahead and make sure that you hit the subscribe button. And then once you hit the subscribe button, you use a little down arrow feature to make sure you have your notifications on, which is important for you because then you won't have to do much work at all in order to be alerted to all the fantastic content we have coming out, like Dispatches with Rania Khalek. I saw you had Crystal Ball on while I was out as well, Rania. So a lot of interesting and exciting people from all ranges of the political spectrum. So you want to be alerted to that, and you don't want to have to work for it or look for it. It'll also help us because I believe that, Google and YouTube do reward you or penalize you based on how many people are getting notifications for the things that they subscribe to. So nonetheless, make sure you hit subscribe, make sure you get your notifications turned on, and you're going to get a lot of positive things yourself. You won't have to look too far for the things you subscribe to, and you'll also help us continue to do what we can to master the algorithmic spread issue. And of course, if you're watching on Free Speech TV, as always, all you got to do is keep watching here, and a big shout out to the whole Free Speech TV team for making it possible for us to appear there as well. Rania, as we get the show started, are there other things you would like to remind our viewers about?
Yes, I would, Eugene. I want to remind people that in addition to liking, subscribing, and sharing this episode, you can help support Breakthrough News by becoming a member and going to patreon.com/breakthrough news, where for as little as $5 a month, you can access exclusive content as well as exclusive merch, such as this very cool mug that both me and Eugene have on every episode to keep us hydrated. Moreover, you can help support independent media like us, I think a very important independent media outlet. So important that YouTube has found it necessary to nuke our views, if anyone else knows. I mean, Eugene, it's hard not to notice. My sister even asked me the other day, she's like, what the hell's going on with your views? It's crazy. Since we hit 1 million subscribers, which is very exciting, our views have just plummeted. And I don't think it's because our content has changed. Our content is still awesome and the same. So if you're as outraged as I am, give a middle finger to YouTube by going to patreon.com/breakthrough news and supporting independent media that YouTube doesn't want you to see.
Yes. And for anyone from the company of YouTube who's watching, we're not talking about you specifically. We actually like you.
No.
So just...
No, but figure out what the hell's going on, man. 1 million subscribers and like a couple hundred watching a live stream is just insane. It's insane. It's not logical. It makes no sense.
That's true.
Unless like all the people who followed us just decided overnight they hated us, which I don't believe.
That can't be true. Well, we will persevere.
No.
We will persevere. So do all those things, and certainly please donate. And a big shout out to all of our existing patrons, by the way. All of your sacrifice and hard work to patronize us here at Breakthrough News has made a huge difference in terms of what we're able to do in front of and behind the camera. Well, we got a good show for you, as we always do, going around the world, touching on many crucial and important issues. And now we want to move forward here by discussing efforts in the labor movement in Canada, but of course a part of the broader issue by workers around the world to put pressure on their governments to stop their complicity with the ongoing genocide in Gaza and broader ethnic cleansing and apartheid in Palestine. We are very, very honored to be joined as we continue the show here by Ahmad, who's a union organizer and campaign strategist, and Vice President of the Canadian Freelance Union. Amina, thanks so much for being back with us.
Thanks for having me again, Eugene and Rania.
Well, listen, it's always an honor to have you here, and I know that you all in the Canadian Freelance Union, along with Labor for Palestine in Canada, are waging a campaign now around an arms embargo, I believe vis-a-vis Unifor. Tell us, what you all are doing, what the aim is, and how the campaign is going so far.
Yeah, well, we are looking forward to having a convention that is happening in Vancouver City, which is unceded Indigenous territory. And we're excited about that convention. We're happy to be part of Unifor, the union, which is one of the largest private sector unions, and it's been a home for many of us. We represent the Canadian Freelance Union, like you said. It represents journalists, media workers, all forms of workers that are in precarious and in the gig economy. And we are also happy that we have drafted an arms embargo resolution in collaboration with Unifor Local 2025, and we have submitted it to proceed to convention. And we hope that it hits the floor, but we don't know if it will. But this resolution is a second step. Already, Unifor, our president, Lana Payne, which we are happy about, has drafted a letter to our Prime Minister, Mark Carney, and called on an arms embargo. We know that in 2017, our union already signed on and passed a motion of boycott, divestment, sanction. So this is another step, another action that unions across Canada are trying to push forward, because we know that our country is complicit, and we are continuing to send military equipment, and we are continuing to be complicit in this genocide.
I'm curious if you can just elaborate a bit more on what specifically your union is asking for in terms of arms embargoes. And maybe if you could just go into some of the key industries or manufacturers involved in arming Israel from Canada specifically.
Yeah, earlier this year, we did some pickets and some symbolic actions at some weapons facilities that we know that are creating components and parts to Israeli military equipment, such as TTM Technologies. We did an action in front of Incus, which was in the heart of Toronto as well. And we are continuing to put this pressure in. PYM, Palestine Youth Movement, and World Beyond War has produced informative information for us about some of these facilities across the country. And we know some of our members actually work in some of these factories, but we know that it's a very small percentage of the workforce that is in it. And throughout this week, we have been phone banking our members, including some of our members that work inside these facilities. And many of them are echoing, that this genocide is like horrible, and that they don't want to be complicit. We know that workers are telling us, whether they work in this or whether they work in the informal economy, that they don't want to be part of this genocide. And that means halting all military and goods that can be implicated in this genocide.
I think that this is a really crucially important issue, especially the sort of convention coming up not that long before we're going to have the UN General Assembly, where a meeting where, of course, Canada is saying that they're going to come and they're going to recognize the Palestinian state and so on and so forth. So, I mean, it feels obviously the time is extremely crucial at all times, given how dire this genocide is. But it does feel like this is corresponding with the fact that, for whatever the reason, even though it's far from enough what they've done so far, it does seem that the movement in solidarity with Palestine is moving in some degree the politics in Canada, and that a resolution like this actually could have an impact on how the government is addressing the broader policies as it concerns the issue of occupied Palestine.
Yes, I do. And last point I want to make as an organizer, we want to basically say that this myth that workers are okay with this genocide is false. We know when we canvass them in front of their facilities, we know when we're phone banking our union leaders, we know that our communities, whether it's faith-based communities, they are all saying they're in opposition to the government sending military equipment to this to Israel. And it has been done before, whether people live in port cities, wherever you live, it has been done before with the U.S. War in Iraq. We know in the past with sending weapons to the Pinochet regime. I mean, the list is long, and we can do it now. There is precedence.
And, in the context of the labor movement, I mean, we've seen port workers across various European countries, unionists in South Africa, take action to block Israeli arms shipments. There's been, attempts made on the U.S. West Coast as well. I'm just curious, when you talk about your union, which is, over 300,000 members, like what does it mean for a union of that scale to take such a bold political stance? And why now?
It's a really big deal for us if our union leader takes this stance. She has already, like we said, drafted a letter to Mark Carney, but we need more. We need more than statements. We have an ability. We have people power. Our members are, like you said, almost 300,000 across the country. And for her to say that will lead us in the right direction. And we know in the past when union leaders have called out atrocities happening on the other side of the world and recognizing that this is international picket. We see it as a picket line. And as unionists and as workers in unions, we see it as an injury to one is an injury to all. And we say picket lines we do not cross. So since boycott, divestment, sanction, and since this resolution coming to the floor, we should see it as a picket. And I really hope that our president hears our concerns from her members and amplifies it.
One thing that I think feels important here in terms of also what's being revealed, and we've talked about the complicity of Canada in the broader piece, but also just the role Canada plays in the world, because especially in the context of Trump's attacks on Canada, the 51st state and all these things, I think the perception is often that there's sort of like a kinder, gentler government north of the United States. And it feels like it's important for people also around the world to be educated about what's happening inside of Canada as it concerns foreign policy generally, of course, but specifically around Palestine, because I do think they're able to often the politicians there sort of ride off of the we're not as bad as the United States kind of reputation.
Yes, I think you had me earlier when the election was happening, and I think Mark Carney, we don't need a conservative government to oppress Palestinian people abroad and to oppress our own communities locally, whether it's indigenous communities or workers' rights. We just saw the flight attendants went on a strike, and this government tried to deem it illegal, and they refused to back down. And this is what the liberal government has been known for, whether it's evading indigenous people's rights and environmental rights and building pipelines, or abroad in terms of foreign politics. We've played a big role in the Middle East and a big role in sort of perpetuating Israeli apartheid. And, that is why it's so important for us as labor activists and union activists to not only call out our government who's complicit, but also we need our leaders to do more. And we need to look at our labor leaders because we know we have a lot of power in what's happening.
I'm curious, this is such a significant move, a development. How has the reaction from the political establishment and the media establishment been to this move by your union?
Well, I think one important point to make is our comrades, our brothers and sisters in one of the maritime provinces, New Brunswick, Federation of Labor already passed a hot cargo resolution, which I wanted to amplify here. And those are workers that are members of the Longshore and other unions that have already passed the hot cargo resolution, which means that they deem goods and services linked to this oppression, linked to this genocide, that we should have the right to potentially disrupt or refuse to move hot cargo. And we know that this has happened in the past. And so our resolution coming to Unifor Convention is part of that wave and part of those mobilizations. And we're not just watching domestically, we're watching internationally. Our brothers and sisters in Tunisia, Morocco, Belgium, workers in India, all across the world. And recently we're watching Microsoft workers, all sorts forms of disruption and solidarity actions. I think it's all intertwined together. And it could lead to this moment where we're going to see a significant shift amongst unions in the next few weeks.
You know, you mentioned earlier that you all are doing a broad canvas, of course, of all the uniform members that you can reach, and that some of them actually do work in military-industrial complex industries. I wonder what you're saying to those workers when you talk to them, which I think is something that a lot of people here in the U.S. especially are also wondering in terms of how they can talk to people in their unions in a similar situation.
Yeah, this is where I'm really good at, is speaking to members. And we've canvassed, like I said, weapons facilities early on after October 7th. And when workers were coming out of those facilities, they said to me, this is wrong. This is a genocide. I don't know what's going to happen. And honestly, I've been at many strikes and pickets in my entire life, and I've never seen workers that on our side, and say that that we don't know what to do, but we know it's wrong. And over the last few weeks, before we go to convention, we've been phone banking presidents and members, and many of them are saying the same thing, that we need our leadership to put forth on an arms embargo resolution. We need more, we need direction. And that's why we are asking our leadership to lead us and give direction. But our members, majority of them, are saying that this is wrong. And we know that workers are saying this globally. And this is because we are heeding to the call of Palestinian workers who've been telling us for decades, that Israeli labor policy is one part of Israeli apartheid, and this genocide is just the top of it. And so we know this, and time is passing. And so we really urge labor leaders to do the right thing and lead labor in this moment.
Yeah, do you think there'll be like a domino effect here? I mean, when such a massive union like this makes this call or makes this demand, I could imagine it would encourage others to take a similar stance.
Yes, I do. And I think that what we saw with trade union leader Chris Smalls, his actions with doing the Gaza Freedom Flotilla, many of our unions, when one union in the Canadian Labour Congress spoke up and spoke up on his behalf, and we showed our solidarity, then all the unions did it. And that's why it's important that the Canadian Labour Congress also demands an arms embargo, and we need that from them at that level, at the international level, to do that.
Mm-hmm. Well, Amina, let me ask you this. If there are trade unionists in Canada who are watching this program and wondering how they can do more around Palestine, where should they go? Where can they look to get educated and involved?
I think that we have to be in our communities, and the unions are part of those communities. Millions of workers, and it's a multiracial workforce, are working, whether it's in the airport, malls, medics, paramedics, in all these places. Unions are working on arms embargo resolutions, pressuring their leadership. And this is just one way we can push for change in our communities, is to be active in our unions and demand an arms embargo now. And we should declare Israeli goods as hot cargo.
Mm-hmm. Well, Amina, as always, we really appreciate you coming and bringing us news from the struggle north of the border. Amina Sheikh, Vice President of the Canadian Freelance Union, thanks so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side. Rania? Well,
Eugene, I think it's great that this happened, and I think it needs to happen more because this horrific violence and genocide in Gaza is only going to get worse, and governments are not stepping in to do anything. So it really leaves it to, these sort of massive groups of people and organizations such as labor unions to take it upon themselves.
Mm-hmm. No, I think absolutely, for sure. And that's the same reason why in the anti-apartheid struggle with South Africa, it became a big tactic, because governments were not really looking to move aggressively to isolate South Africa. So the people themselves started doing it with arms embargoes, with hot cargoing, with refusing cultural exchanges and elements that we know of in the context of BDS here with Palestine. And I agree with you. I think it's only becoming more and more important. It's always been important. But the acuteness of the crisis is such that, maybe now, if you haven't done anything yet, now is certainly the time to act. And And I think labor, as always, has a very important role to play in this context. So yeah, it should be interesting. And yeah, huge union, Unifor in Canada. So if they were to, I think this would actually have resonance in the United States as well, if they were able to pass a resolution like this. And I think it would certainly hearten a lot of people in the United States. But there's a very close relationship between the US and Canadian labor movement. A lot of people don't know that. So the things that they do there often do have a ripple effect here in the United States in terms of what labor is willing to do.
No, that's awesome. I'm very excited to see where this goes. And I mean, just stop putting shipments on boats to those workers who work in the ports. Just stop. The Israelis can't get weapons if they're not being loaded at ports.
It's a very good point. It's a very good point. Very good point. Well, let's move to another important development in the, I don't know if I should call it the Anglosphere. That sounds weird, but there is a connection. There's some connection between the U.S., Canada, and now we're going to Britain. It feels like there's something there. I don't know. But nonetheless, some very, very important political developments. New political parties, attacks by the government on the Palestine movement, some interrelationship between those two things. So to turn to all of this and more, we are very, very honored to be joined on the show once again by Ashok Kumar, who is an associate professor of political economy at Birkbeck University of London. Ashok, as always, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, it's great to have you here. I'm sure a lot of people have seen the new party that's launched there in the UK, Your Party, with Jeremy Corbyn and other figures. Many people are joining. But, we just got off talking about arms embargoes and unions in Canada and Gaza and the broader Palestine liberation movement. And it kind of brings me to my first question is Zahra Sultana, who is a minister of parliament, who is also one of the members of your party. I saw she recently came out and said that the smears won't work this time. The attempt to shut down this new political movement by smearing it for being anti-Semitic will not succeed, that they will hold strong in solidarity with Palestine. And I just want to ask you, do you see any connection with the rapid rise of hundreds of thousands of people signing up almost overnight for this new political party and the surge in solidarity we've seen in the UK for around Palestine over the past 2 years?
Yeah, okay, so firstly, it's not called Your Party. Just to clarify, that was a way to be like, you can come up with the name. It's built from the ground up. But yeah, obviously it's the website's called Your Party, so people can sign up. And 800,000 people have signed up in less than a month. You have to then consider the fact that, our population is 1/5 that of the U.S. So imagine less than a month, a new party has, that many people that have signed up in the U.S. And so even if a third of the people who've signed up sign up to become members, which almost certainly will happen, it'll be the biggest party in Britain. 2/3 sign up, it'll be bigger than every party in Britain combined. So the fact is it's very obvious that a significant proportion of the country is yearning for a genuinely socialist and anti-imperialist politics. And why I say anti-imperialist is because you have a Green Party, which is pretty left-wing on lots of issues, but have been very soft until recently on the imperialism question, and were attacking Jeremy Corbyn when he was the leader of the Labour Party from 2015 to 2019 from the right on these kinds of questions. But yes, it's been a sort of messy launch. And the reason it's been a messy launch is because there are these real tensions between those who, and those aren't like big P political tensions. Those are tensions about structure and who controls the party. And on one side, you have these kind of advisors and bureaucrats, the same people who, during the Corbyn leadership, watered down policy and capitulated to the sort of establishment smears on anti-Semitism, which was really just an attack because he was pro-Palestinian, as we know, that which has now really come to light, obviously, since October 7th, those kinds of tactics. And they were against sort of the democracy reforms, or they capitulated on the democracy reforms. So Zahra Sultana is really addressing, not really Jeremy Corbyn specifically, because he was very consistent and principled. And even he sort of stood up against the IHRA. And you see from the numerous autopsies that have come out that it was him that was principled, but his advisors, the same advisors who are trying to control the party now, are the ones that consistently sort of pushed him to the right and sort of to moderate and to capitulate. And so they caved repeatedly when he was actually quite principled and repeatedly principled. So Zahra Sultana, and not just her, but like movement leaders and ordinary members, do not want to repeat the failures of laborism, specifically on these kinds of questions. So when she comes out and says, make no mistakes, come at me with your smears, we're anti-Zionist, she's speaking to that composition of people that know what happened, can see through what the attacks and the effect of those attacks, and don't want to see a repeat of that. So the real fight right now is between sort of real democracy in the party and bureaucracy. And so the demand right now, really, if you see the internal documents and even publicly, is is that when the conference happens, which is scheduled for November, that it's one member, one vote. It isn't mediated through some kind of bureaucracy and delegate system, and that those elections, that all the leadership positions are voted in by the members, not sort of anointed through systems of patronage, and that the Constitution is actually written and voted on by us. It's the members, not drafted by the sort of same old establishment advisors who were there from 2015 to 2019 in some back office. So this is really what Zara's trying to do really is try to break with the sort of top-down laborism that you saw then, and really the party, if done right, this party can be sort of the biggest, most democratic, most radical political force really in British history. Not just another sort of hollow brand, but a genuine vehicle for the working class, for socialism and anti-imperialism.
I think it's so exciting, and honestly, I think the name of your party, even if it's just a filler for the moment, has a nice ring to it. Your party. But I do want to ask, this is very exciting, but there's also been other exciting left parties and movements and leadership that has arisen in the last, let's say, 10 to 15 years that's failed. So I'm curious, I imagine some of those failures are lessons to look at for creating a new party. So what lessons are being drawn from the failures of, previous left projects like Syriza or Podemos, or even Corbyn's own leadership of Labour, which obviously had lots of reasons why that didn't work out. But it's important, obviously, to look back and reflect to know how to move past those obstacles going forward.
Yeah, that's an important question. So, if you're comparing it to Syriza was obviously a kind of coalition of left forces. This is the Greek, left-wing party. It was a coalition of Trotskyists, Maoist parties, and sort of Euro-communists who were the dominant force, synopsis most. And a lot of the capitulation that happened during that time was due to pressure from the Troika. And because of the sort of more moderate politics of synopsis most, the Euro-communists. In this party, with your party or the new party, we don't have to really contend with that. We've already learned the lessons, hopefully, of what happened between 2015 and 2019. And that's sort of like building up calluses. What it does is allow you to see your opponent's strategies for what they are. It exposes it for what they are. But with that, you get the good part of that, which means you can see your opponents for what they've done, and they've revealed themselves a little bit too much. But the bad part is that you're carrying with you also the trauma and the politics and the divisions and of that period as well. And you're seeing some of that really play themselves out to some extent with these early days of the party. And lots of people are saying, oh, this is the tensions of the left, whatever. You're trying to bring together nearly 1 million people, different political tendencies. Of course you're going to have tensions, and those tensions are going to be played out sometimes publicly. But it doesn't mean that there isn't a real drive to try to make this happen. Podemos, on the other hand, they did some good things, but they were trying to concede too much ground on discourse. And I think that you don't really see that happening here. You don't see people saying, we're not socialists, we're not this, we're not that. And so it's really early days. I don't know. I mean, certainly we should be learning those lessons, even from what's happening in France, Mélenchon, what's happening in. It's not just learning the bad parts, but also learning what they did effectively.
I wonder, obviously it's early days, so it's tough to say, but what you think about the potential effect is on the Labour Party here. I mean, it seemed like it was basically the day after 500,000 people had signed up, then all of a sudden Keir Starmer was saying, we may recognize Palestine and making all these different sort of points. So it felt to me like they were feeling a little bit of heat, as it were, on their back from this expectation. But obviously they've gone so far to the right in terms of how they're trying to message things. I wonder if you think this might be a relief to them, perhaps, because some people who they view as irritants are now outside of the party, or if it could seriously affect their calculations going into the next general election.
Well, Eugene, it depends if you think that recognizing Palestine is is theater. Of course, they can say. I mean, he didn't even recognize Palestine. He said, if you stop starving the people of Gaza, maybe in September, when everyone in Gaza has basically been starved to death, we might recognize Palestine. That's basically what he said. And that's off the back of France already agreeing and Canada making overtures towards it. So, that putting that to one side, I don't think that was necessarily motivated by this. I mean, you had like over 200 Labour MPs, people who don't stand for anything, saying you should sign up to this. Many of them members of Labour Friends of Israel. So it tells you that this might be some form of theater. Like, what does it mean to recognize Palestine even? The real question is what they've done around people who've protested. So you have Palestine Action here who have targeted Israeli the arms companies that are arming the genocide and fueling the genocide. They've consistently stopped it. They've shut down 3 factories permanently. They've been a real force in this country. And not only did they charge the people that were arrested by Palestine Action under terrorism offenses, which not even the Tory government did, but that preceded us, but they then prescribed it as a terrorist organization, an unprecedented move. And since then, you've had hundreds of people. The largest arrest, a single arrest of a group of people in this country's history, 500 people, 350 people last week. You know, every week, hundreds and hundreds of people getting arrested, elderly people, disabled people, just for holding signs that said, we support Palestine Action and the genocide. And so they're coming down so hard. It's not a sort of rational choice, because what it does is it exposes the country, the government, for what they are, which is you're arming the genocide still. You haven't stopped arming it. You're training Israeli soldiers, which you've admitted to do just weeks ago. You came out in the days following October 7th to say Israel had a right to starve Gaza, and you haven't apologized for that, and you haven't even recognized that. And you're running daily surveillance over Gaza, which you're doing on behalf of Israel. So it just sort of exposes really what the government and what Starmer and what the Labour government have been up to, but also it's being reflected in the polls. You have record-breaking disapproval of this government. So and it's only been a year since he got elected. So it was an election won on sand. It doesn't mean anything. And unfortunately, reform is dominating in the polls. I mean, just weeks ago, there was a poll that was done of this new party that doesn't even have a name, doesn't even have any membership, isn't really even registered, and Labour, and both were at 15% each. So that tells you how deeply, deeply unpopular this government is.
I mean, it's really, really incredible. But, you know, I'm curious, we already talked about Gaza. There's the Israeli elephant in the room, because we've seen what the Israelis and their supporters in the UK are capable of doing to sabotage any sort of political momentum towards progressivism, because progressivism and leftism, you know, goes hand in hand with equality for Palestinians. So are you all prepared for that level of attack and sabotage? And I guess I'm going to throw another question on top of that. What has the response been so far to this party? Has it been hostile from the media and the political establishment?
So obviously, Zionist institutions have come out and basically, Board of Deputies and others have said, Sarah, this party is anti-Semitic, whatever. What's surprising is none of the press have really run with that story, because they just have that just doesn't fly anymore. I mean, you have to remember in 2019, when Jeremy Corbyn in a debate referenced Jeffrey Epstein and referred to him as Epstein, this is a known, most famous pedophile in the world. The press and the Zionist institutions called it anti-Semitic because he said it sounded too German. I mean, this is the levels that we had reached in 2018.
It doesn't even make sense.
And it doesn't even make any sense, because that's how you pronounce his name. So, so none of those things, none of those attacks, even Zara coming out and saying, I'm an anti-Zionist, your smears aren't going to work. The press didn't even run it, and she's basically co-leading this party. And so what that means is not because they're not going to try every tactic. It's just become so transparent. So what I imagine they'll do is use other attempts. So even you look at far-right characters in this country like Tommy Robinson, who founded the English Defense League, and others are funded directly, and this is well known, funded directly by Israeli institutions and Israeli Zionist-funded institutions. So what they'll do is try to stir up some of this, and they'll try to use other attempts that aren't anti-Semitism, because I think the value of that attack has really been hollowed out by them. And so it's yet to be seen. They will attempt, obviously, to sabotage and undermine, but there doesn't seem to have been an effective tactic so far in the last month since it's been launched.
Well, a lot to watch and a lot to see, and I think it's going to be very interesting when we see the conference this fall. As always, Ashok Kumar, it really is a pleasure to have you here with us on the Freedom Side.
Thanks for having me.
Rania?
I mean, I think this is super exciting. I can't wait to see where it goes, and I'm sure Zionists are losing their goddamn minds.
Yes. I'm sure it's sort of like a Groundhog Day effect for them. They thought they had it all sewed up there, but not quite. So yeah, I think it's very interesting, very exciting, and just another example of how I think the sands are shifting, so to speak, all across the Western world. I mean, there's a lot of contradictions, but I don't think it's all just doom and gloom in terms of the political direction of where things are headed.
No, I think this demonstrates that Gaza is really, Israel's genocide in Gaza is dramatically changing Western politics everywhere except for maybe Germany. I think.
Yeah.
But
maybe even there,
what do you
because
expect
why are
from
they
Nazis?
cracking down so hard unless they're afraid? You
Right.
know?
That's true. That's true. But it's really changing politics in the U.S., obviously in the UK and other European countries as well. I mean, it's at a huge human toll that's like unimaginable, really, because it's just the most horrifying things we've ever seen. But this destruction of Gaza is just so apocalyptic that I don't think Israel can ever recover. And I think it's also really left a stain on politics in the West. Like, it's really exposed just the rot and the undemocratic nature of how our systems work. Because once you understand that this support for this apartheid ethno-state that's committing a disgusting, horrific genocide with weapons that we're funding is happening despite the will of the people, it makes you think about all the other parts of all the other policies that are so unbelievably unpopular that, continue to move forward in these Western countries despite the democratic will of the people. I mean, really, Palestine can be such a radicalizing issue because it exposes everything else rotten about our system.
Yeah. No, it's the bleeding edge of so many other problems, and I think it's pretty easy to see that when you confronted with all these facts. So yeah, well, it'll be interesting to see what happens in the UK and also around the world as we continue to see more fallout politically for those who are directly complicit in this genocide. Well, we want to move to another critically important issue in the region, and that is the ongoing issues in Syria, which of course have many different implications for Palestine, for Lebanon, for the entire region, really for the entire world, given the importance of that region. And we are very, very honored to get into this, to have with us Josh Landis, the Sandra Mackey Chair and Director of the Center for Middle East Studies at the University of Oklahoma. Dr. Landis, thank you so much for being with us.
It's a pleasure being with you.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you here with us. And there's a lot of things happening. It's tough for me to even know where to start. I probably should have just let Rania start. But, we've had these trilateral talks happening in Paris, the United States, the Syrian foreign minister, the Israeli strategic affairs minister. Some people are saying it's the U.S. is trying to push normalization between Syria and Israel. Some are saying they're just trying to calm down the tensions between Syria and Israel over southern Syria and the issues happening with the Druze population. I wonder how you see these talks, what the U.S. goal is here, and what some of the implications could be.
Well, the U.S. I think is fighting on two fronts. We have the policy that was pronounced by President Trump and his special envoy to Syria, Tom Barak, who is the ambassador to Turkey, who embraced Sharaa, the new president, and really gave them carte blanche. Said, we're lifting sanctions, we want you to stabilize, this is your big chance. At the same time, once they cracked down on the Jebel Druze, the Druze region, that's 3%, a minority, heterodox Shiite minority in the south of Syria, near the Golan Heights, the Israelis said, we are protecting the Druze because we have Druze in Israel, and bombed the Ministry of Defense in Damascus, threatened the president of Syria, and really stopped the Syrian government in its tracks from consolidating its power over the rest of Syria and stop this presidential move to integrate the Jebel Druze, to destroy its autonomous regime and integrate it into larger Syria, which Barak, the special envoy, had said was a goal of America. But just yesterday and the day before, we saw Barak in Paris, where there was a special meeting with the foreign minister of Syria. And who was he embracing? He was embracing the Druze leader of Israel. And Israel was there meeting with Shada's foreign minister, saying, we want a special corridor to resupply the Jebel Druze in Syria, which was completely undermine Damascus's effort to spread its control over the whole of Syria. So America's policy is run into a big speed bump, which is Israel. And today there are two counter policies that are running side by side. There is the expressed Trump policy, which was, we want to support Damascus. And there is the Israeli policy, which is, we don't like the new rulers in Damascus. We want to keep them weak. We want to keep Syria divided, and we are going to protect the Druze and not let them integrate. And we'd like the Kurds to remain independent as well in the north. So those are two diametrically opposed policies. One is integration of a sovereign Syria with Damascus leading everything. And the other is a much more federal, decentralized system that Israel is pushing. And the United States is caught in between. And I think Trump will be caught in between too.
It's interesting to see how much daylight there is between what the U.S. wants, with the U.S. vision for Syria versus the Israeli vision for Syria. But just to zoom in, Josh, I mean, it's not that Ahmad al-Sharaa is not doing himself any favors in terms of trying to unify, because forces that are involved in his government have been complicit in carrying out these massacres against minorities, first on the coast against Alawites a few months ago, and now in Sweda, and it's pushed the Kurds to recently have this minority conference to try to maintain some sort of autonomy for these various regions, which goes against what Ahmad al-Sharaa himself wants, which is one undivided Syria. So I'm curious if you can talk a bit about, you know, what you think is going on in the thinking here. Is this somebody who is a former al-Qaeda leader who's unable to shed his ideology? Is it somebody who doesn't have control over his own forces, who, you know, investigation after investigation has found that forces, again, in his own security forces, are involved in these horrific massacres that we're seeing play out, that are in fact leading to the disintegration of this country if this were to continue?
Well, Rania, that is the million-dollar question, and I've been wrestling with it. You know, let me start with an anecdote. This is an anecdote that takes place told by an Alawite who was caught up in the massacres in March. Two of his sons and a bunch of his other family members were killed in front of his eyes. And these were regime soldiers sent in by the president to take charge of the region. There had been some Alawites had shot some security people, and he called he called Syrians a general alert in the country to go to the coast and to stick it to the Alawites, essentially. Now, he claims that he only wanted, you know, transitional justice. But what happened, this story will be, I think, important in the sense that we were debriefing this guy, trying to take his story down, and he explained he had been beaten up badly, a 62-year-old Alawite man, and then they lifted him up and they forced him to watch these soldiers, 15 soldiers, as they shot his two sons and other family members in front of his eyes. And when they had finished, he asked them, he said, "Why are you doing this?" And they said that this leading officer said to him, "Your dead bodies are our stairway to heaven."
Wow.
And then So this is important for two reasons. One is these were regime soldiers, not some wild militia. Two, transitional justice. When you hear the word transition, and Westerners hear the word transitional justice, they think, oh, we've got some kind of police force that's going in to find Alawites who are members of Assad's regime who committed crimes. And they're going to go in front of a judge or a jury or something, and they're going to be tried for their crimes and they're going to be punished. But what these soldiers see as transitional justice is God's justice. It's a religious justice because they see these people as unbelievers who are heterodox, who are not Muslims, and they should be punished. Now, when these soldiers had to decide whether they were going to kill a 62-year-old man who had just watched his family be killed, they dragged him in front of what they called their sheikh. So the commanding officer of this unit in the Syrian army was called the sheikh. That's a religious title. He was a 35-year-old, and they said, should we kill this guy? And then the guy began to quiz him on Islam and said, what is the Shahada? Can you tell me what it, repeat this? And then how many rak'ah do you do? How many different prayers at different times of the day to see if he was a Muslim or not a Muslim? Fortunately, this guy knew all the answers. But so then the guys waved him and said, okay, he can live. But the point here is, once again, this was a religious test about his guilt and whether he deserved death or not. This was nothing to do with his activities under the old regime, crimes, or anything else. It was purely a religious thing. And the question is then, does Sharaa condone that? And he is Al-Qaeda. He spent 20 years in the trenches preaching this stuff. Now, even if he wants to reverse it, the new police force he's built, we have videos of a few of their graduation ceremonies. And in one ceremony, you see the commanding officer who is graduating these new cadets, let's say 50 cadets that are graduating in to become police, and they ask them, they say, Dasturina, Dasturina. He yells at his crowd, what is our constitution? And the cadets respond to him. They say, Al-Quran, Al-Quran. The Quran is our constitution. Then he says, Sabilina, Sabilina. What is our way? And they chant back, Jihad. Jihad is our way. So the indoctrination of this new Syrian force is Islamic. It's the same indoctrination that Al-Qaeda was giving to their forces. And so it's little wonder that when these troops come into a village of heterodox unbelievers from their point of view, and that's what happened in the Jebel Druze. People were asked, what is your religion? And then they were shot. And we saw many of those videos. And, and you, if I'm not wrong, are partly Druze, or maybe all Druze. I don't know.
Yeah, my family is Lebanese Druze.
And you had a very ugly experience recently, I know, which you put on Facebook and I read, and my heart went out to you but that is the sort of thing that family after family in Syria has been experiencing. They're called pigs, they're called unbelievers, they're called apostates, and then they're shot. And they're treated with complete contempt by this military and police force. Now, is that a mistake? It's hard to believe that it's a mistake because it's so deeply ingrained in these new forces, and they're not embarrassed to do it, and they do it over and over again. And the president has not come out and said, you can't do that. We're not a religious state anymore, because he is a religious state. In the new constitution that he promulgated, he states the state, the government respects God's religions, and he said El Diyan al-Samawiyya. That's our heavenly religions, and the only heavenly religions in the eyes of these rulers are Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, interestingly enough, because they are Ahl al-Kitab. And the Druze, the Ismailis, the Alawites are not considered. They're considered to be man-made religions that show man's evil and animal desires. And in the Syrian school textbooks that were used until about 8 years ago, it says, how do you treat an atheist or a pagan? They say you have to kill them or convert them. And those are the two alternatives. And Druze are considered to be pagans because, as are Alawites and Ismailis, because they don't just worship Allah, they worship Ali, or in the case of Druze, al-Hakim, and so forth. And so they consider them pagans. And that's, how do you overcome that? That explains a lot about what's going on in the Jebel Druze and why the Jebel Druze are grateful to Israel for having put a stop to these massacres that were taking place in the Jebel.
Well, it brings me to the next question I want to ask you before we let you go here. I mean, is it even possible with this sort of government sitting in Damascus to even maintain a unitary state in Syria as we know it, given all of the various different fault lines and their ideology?
Well, there's not a unitary state. The Kurds own 1/3, almost a third of Syria, everything north of the Euphrates. The Druze have an autonomous government in the south. Israel has said that the Syrian army cannot deploy south of Damascus, and it's going to protect the Druze. So, and Turkey has its troops in a hunk of the north. So the country is not unified, and it's hard to see how it's going to become unified without respecting its citizens, because the Kurds, who own a big hunk of territory, which has most of the oil, a lot of agriculture and water, are saying, we don't want to do this because we don't trust you, because you're going to do to us what you have done to the Druze and the Alawites. And they have good reason to believe so. So this is, now it's possible he could do it anyway. He could just use force and marshal this jihadist forces behind him and destroy them. And Turkey would support him if he does that. So everything rests on America right now. And so all eyes are looking at Washington, D.C. Will Washington protect the Kurds, or will it kick them to the curb? And that's the real question that we're all trying to find out. And 4 congressmen just went. I'm an Oklahoman. One of the Druze that was killed in Jebel Druze was an Oklahoman American citizen. And our senator went to Damascus and met and shook hands and embraced. Shut up. But I know the Druze community here in Oklahoma, which is not teeny, are up in arms, and they're trying to convince him, you can't just give them carte blanche because they'll massacre us. And so this is a very important question, and Americans are divided on it. Of course, most Americans don't have a clue what's going on. So shows like yours today are very important. And it's a time when America's making that decision, and every congressman is going to have to figure out where they fall on this question.
Well, very high stakes, a lot to follow, and we really appreciate you joining us here and helping us sort through it all. Dr. Josh Landis, Director of the Center for Middle East Studies at the University of Oklahoma, thank you so much for being with us here on the Freedom Side.
Well, thank you both. Rania, it's always a pleasure.
Always a pleasure. I'm glad we got to get Josh on to talk about that, because I mean, it's just crazy what's been taking place and the videos you see online. And I mean, I have to say, like, also, Eugene, it's really horrifying too, the way the Israelis are stepping in and trying to use this to their benefit. I mean, and then what do you say to people like what do you say to people who are like, they weren't anti-state, especially the Druze of the South, they weren't anti-state, but when you start massacring them, some of the, the people who are shouting the loudest about Israel, come protect us, are going to suddenly gain traction. And it's just absolutely horrible. It's absolutely a horrible situation. So we'll see how it plays out. We'll continue to cover it here.
Yes, we will. And wow, yeah, you're right. It's a horrible situation, but we will help you sort through it all. And thankfully, we have you right there in the center of the region to help us report directly on all these important issues. Well, we're going to turn to another important issue, and that is the Trump federal takeover of Washington, D.C., so to speak, the surge of military and militarized forces into the District of Columbia by the White House under a variety of pretenses. Most of them I personally would say are false. But to dig into all of this and many of the implications of it, we are very, very happy to be joined here on the show once again by Lawrence Grandpre, who's the Director of Research at Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. Lawrence, thank you so much for being back with us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, it's great to have you here as always. And it's interesting when this first federal takeover, when Trump first announced this and he had the crazy press conference with him and, Judge Janine and the whole thing. I mean, it was so over the top. So there was that. And I certainly don't want to excuse anything they were doing. But there was one undercurrent of it that was interesting to me, that a lot of the sort of practical things they were saying about, quote unquote crime in DC, about how to address homelessness, didn't actually seem that different from the Bowser administration. Other than the fact that, obviously DC is a very liberal city, so it's always dressed up in a whole other concern, and we have services and we have this, that, and the third. But the core basic premises of criminalization, of all these different issues seem very similar. So anyway, I say all that just to ask you as my first question is, in some ways, when we look at the kind of lack of pushback from the DC government on this issue, does some of that seem to be that this is kind of convenient for them, that Trump is so outrageous that they can use him as a foil to pursue similar things, but in a way that perhaps will seem less intense as moving forward?
I think that's part of it. So I do think that between the Ring cameras, the laws in 2024, and the increase in visible homelessness and addiction, that's a liberal obsession with crime that's not been seen since, I believe, the crack era. So we have these local news stations like Sinclair Media pumping blue cities, including DC, with propaganda consistently trying to convince, working class Black folks that the community's unsafe. We're going back to the crack era. And Black politicians are in a really tough spot because they have been forced into greatness in some ways over the past decade by grassroots activism to do things like decriminalize cannabis, and some of those invest in violence prevention, and they have led to violence declines. But there is this constant pressure from the center of the Democratic Party in Capitol that sees these crackdowns as in their interest for things like gentrification. So DC is unique because because the Home Rule Act, the mayor doesn't have a lot of power to formally push back, and she's getting a lot of pressure from political insiders, including the wife of Marion Barry, to say, keep your powder dry. We got to focus on keeping the kids out the streets because the guard might literally shoot them. So it's not to say that this is a good rate situation, and we don't want to confuse performative politics with actual resistance. But the reality is that Black leaders like Bowser have been forced to capitulate to these pro-police interests, massively increasing the budget. But again, that doesn't mean that the community has not made real progress on crime through grassroots violence interventions. And we need to talk more about that, because that's the answer to how we actually deal with crime. And if we fall back too much into the root cause arguments on poverty and homelessness, then that almost can work against us, because liberals are co-opting those arguments and say, I see homeless people. I see people who have visible addiction, and that makes me feel unsafe. And if we don't have a good answer that grounds the solution in community, they're going to co-opt the arguments of the left to feed that carceral solution.
Yeah, I think it's a really, really important point you're raising. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit on how liberals are actually reinforcing some of the approaches that the right likes to talk about, but they do it under the guise of sort of like a balanced approach. And you mentioned some of the whole dealing with the root causes, but can you elaborate on what the problem is with the sort of liberal approach to dealing with quote unquote crime and violence and all these things?
So there's this obsession with procedural justice within the liberal mind. If it's constitutional, and if I can claim to be doing constitutional policing, that's what consent decrees give us, right? So in that world, there are lawyers, there's all this process. And so when liberals, including the governor of New Mexico, deploys the National Guard to deal with crime ginned up with things like Sinclair local media hysteria, it's seen as legitimate because it's actually a constitutional process. And you have this notion of a balanced approach. And again, we have to be precise about what's happening because they're switching from mass incarceration, broken windows to this focused deterrence model that there are these criminal networks, there are these groups of people, and we only want to lock up those groups. When you talk about groups, you're talking about people in community, they group up. It's natural, right? So if you're talking about groups of people that are adjacent to violence, that's like a huge chunk of especially Black communities that have been hyper incarcerated. And again, when the left needs to be precise about how its rhetoric is being co-opted and how in some ways it's not meeting the moment to have the precision to talk about this, because they use public health language, the liberals, to justify these forced deterrence, targeted policing of groups of people that are adjacent to violence. And we know how gang databases work. There can be whole entire communities, again, very similar to Palestine, where they have those hit lists if you're friends with someone who's friends with someone in Hamas. Similar things are happening, but they're using like epidemiological language, saying we have to surgically scoop out the cancer of criminality and only target those networks, right? And so when we see the left say things like don't fund police, fund public health, that ignores the ways in which the public health rhetoric has been co-opted to justify a lot of policing and a little bit of social services, a little bit of connection to a job training and cognitive behavioral therapy, all these things that they use for these violence intervention programs that come from the top down. The bottom up talks about culture, oppression, talks about mobilizing people's political consciousness as a violence prevention tool. But for the left, that's not very material. That's not universal housing. That's not universal basic income. So that gets the short shrift. But it's really the only explanation, again, as to why crime is actually declining. The blue cities that do this, Newark, Philly, Baltimore, massive declines. The red cities that don't, Memphis, St. Louis, you don't see those declines. So we have to talk about the value of powering grassroots violence intervention that use culture and use people's like lived experience to actually deal with crime, because otherwise people don't know what to do and they default to police or they default to the big box white nonprofits.
No, I think that's a critically important point, especially because that has been the discussion in DC prior to this, is the sort of kind of halfway measures that have come in where there was the big push around the NEAR Act and around violence interruption, then sort of co-optation of it, and then sort of, how to actually structure it and move it forward. And it's, been an interesting conversation and important struggle. But I just say that as an entryway into saying, I hope you could talk more about that. I mean, because this is, I think, the confusion that people have, because now that violence interruption has become kind of a meme in and of itself because of the co-optation of what it really is and what it should be and how it actually is most effective. Because as you pointed out with some of the cities you just listed, I mean, the results have been dramatic, in fact, what we've seen in terms of the reduction of murders, shootings, and other forms of crime, violent crime, quote unquote.
Yeah, so just so people have context, most violent crime isn't a homeless person on the street, isn't someone who's mentally ill. It's people in community that are in groups that are just living under oppression, and minor things lead to beefs. And you have these violence interrupters, people who are part of street organizations, formerly so-called gangs, who can interrupt conflict before it happens. So that's the important thing, is that they're actually preventing violence before it starts. And we see the right wing attack it because it's seen as basically giving thugs a second chance and they're not really reformed. But we also see folks on the left attack it. There was a scandal in DC around basically kickbacks around people funding violence prevention. And that feeds the narratives. Oh, Black politicians hooking each other up. It's not really doing the work. But again, just objectively, it's one of the only things that's different over the past 5 years. Like, what's happened is that these folks who traditionally have not been getting money have gotten, we've tried everything else. We've tried housing first. We've tried mass incarceration. We've tried focused deterrence. So it's not just that they're doing services, because anyone can do services, and a lot of people do. It's that the term violence intervention comes out of the Black Panthers in the 70s. Credible messengers is the term. And these are folks who are not just credible because they've been in the streets, they're credible because they've turned their life around. Mm-hmm. They've turned the righteous indignation that gets turned against people in their own communities and street violence into a political conscientization. And it's not just a methodology that works for violence intervention. It also can work for people experiencing addiction. So we know harm reduction is important. But again, if the left only goes to harm reduction and ignores these sort of cultural specifics, political tools that have been essential for Black people to address crime and addiction over the past 50 years of our history. They've gotten funded over the past 5 years, not because of Black politicians just being great. Community forced that American Rescue Plan Act money to go to them, right? So the left has to know that and advocate for that, because again, otherwise, if Trump or the liberals cut the money, we're going to see crime spike. And then we're going to see the liberals say, I guess we got to bring in the National Guard, or I guess we got to do more focused deterrence. And so while we wait for universal basic income, while we work for the root cause solutions, these critical services that have been forced into these blue cities are what is different over the past 5 years that brought in these, again, 50%. Newark has had a 60% decline in murders. And you're not seeing those declines in cities that aren't not just doing the services, but explicitly using these grassroots community-based violence intervention services.
I mean, so what is it that the left is missing here? Or I guess when we talk about left, like, do you think that these are just not as known as strategies? They just don't get as publicized. Like, why are these things that you're talking about missing from the conversation? And I don't mean to, just like punch the left here, but I mean, just generally speaking, on the progressive end of things, you don't see as much of what you're talking about.
I think it's a few things. I think the assumption is when you see Black politicians and liberals sell us out, they look at the politicians and say, well, those cities, there must be nothing that's worth looking at those cities. There's nothing worth looking at there. So they don't see the grassroots organizations forcing those people to do good things because they're not champions. And so you can not be a champion and be forced to do good things. Also, it's not material. It's not $1 billion of redistribution. It's not universal basic income. The left is very materialist. And so culture feels abstract, and it feels like the wokeism that's been used to attack the left, right? And I've workshopped this a little bit, but think about it within the context of Palestine. You would never expect the Palestinians to just accept food aid from the U.S. government forever, and that would be enough to cause peace there. No, they need sovereignty, right? And same thing with just generally, just the limitations of Abu Mazen or Mahmoud Abbas or the PLA does not invalidate the idea of Palestinian sovereignty. But because of anxieties around Black political governance, the idea that it's not progressive and that wokeism has been used to attack the left, the basic idea that Black people need resources that they control, and that's the only way we're ever going to get peace in the Black community, it's not as intuitive when it comes to the Black community as it is for a place like Palestine. And just similarly, like, just because there's some limits to political Islam in Palestine doesn't mean we don't understand why people would vote for political Islamic parties like the Muslim Brotherhood. But when it comes to like the Nation of Islam, and the Nation of Islam is a critical part of violence prevention work here in Black cities, the left has incredible anxieties about those types of organizations. So it's understandable, but the reality is the community is not just choosing these entities, they are proven to work in ways that the left doesn't have a comparable example of getting these type of violence declines, but the Black community has produced it. And again, if you want to actually win over Black people, and again, linking the oppression of the tough on crime crowd is oftentimes very much the same people who support Zionism. The Lock the Black Kids Up crowd in Baltimore is the exact same people that support the Zionist oppression of Palestine. We can make these alliances actually equitable to actually have the left come out in support of getting these orgs funded and showing the links of the oppression in Baltimore and Black America to the oppression in Palestine. I think that would really require a confrontation of the left understanding the value of Black political sovereignty and solving the problems they're trying to solve. And they just got to get over the anxiety around that.
Mm-hmm. You know, real quick, since you sort of mentioned the direct connections between the Zionist movement, we talked about Sinclair Media. I know we talked about this a couple times on election night last year. I wanted you to just talk a little bit more about that, because it really is a direct, palpable connection between these two narratives here that I think deserves to be mentioned.
And you can't understand what's happening in D.C. without it. So Howard Friedman is the former head of AIPAC. He was the first Orthodox head of AIPAC. He lives in Baltimore, Northwest Baltimore, Orthodox Jewish enclave in Northwest Baltimore City in the Baltimore County. He's on the board of Sinclair Media. Sinclair Media is a right-wing, Trump-supporting entity that controls local media all throughout the country. All local media can be, if it bleeds, it leads. But Sinclair is overt propaganda. Sometimes they talk about Trump, sometimes they don't. But in Baltimore, they're running more stories about like someone tears down an Israeli flag. They'll run a story on that. But they'll do story after story around youth crime, youth carjacking, youth are out of control, youth are not being prosecuted. So the points you talked about in the press conference come directly out of Sinclair Media's talking points. And other people like citations needed. They independently made an understanding that the way they talk about Black youth, Sinclair Media, is the exact same way they talk about Palestinians. They only understand force. They only understand violence. They have to be deterred to extreme state violence. And that's part of why Maryland has the most youth incarcerated as adults of anywhere in the country. They're literally off the chart. You cannot put Maryland's youth incarceration in the data of other states because it'll skew the data too much, right? And that's the reality of the psychology of Zionism. So when politicians like Dalia Attar, the senator from Northwest Baltimore City, supports things like rolling back juvenile protections a couple years ago, it's an extension of the Zionist logic of the people in her district that support her and fund her, including Howard Friedman, the former head of AIPAC. And again, it's not surprising that a Sinclair media station is blasting propaganda into DC and the DC suburbs, creating this manufactured concern over crime.
Wow. Well, a lot there and a lot we'll have to continue to keep watching as this so-called 30 days and perhaps longer rolls on in D.C. and the implications around the country. Lawrence Grandpre, Director of Research at Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, thank you so much, as always, for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you for having me.
Rania?
I thought that was a fantastic breakdown. I really appreciated what he had to say, and I think anybody who wants to fight crime needs to watch this interview.
Yeah, no, I agree. And LBS doing great work in Baltimore, around the state of Maryland, and really around the country and helping lead the conversation on this. So we appreciate them always being willing to come on. And that's why we're bringing them on regularly moving forward. We're going to move forward with the show here to another just sort of another critical area. Everything we talk about every time is critical. But we had Canada earlier in the show. Now we're going to go to Mexico. A lot happening, including good statistics on poverty and bad news potentially from the United States vis-a-vis the issue of the U.S. government and the military. So we are honored to be joined, as we always are, by Kurt Hackbarth, who's a writer, journalist for Jacobin, and host of the Soberania podcast, which is fantastic and which you must listen to. Kurt, as always, thank you so much for being with us.
No, thanks for having me, guys. Always a pleasure.
No, the pleasure is all mine. Well, let's try to start with some good news before we get into things that may be negative, and that is new research has come out about the implications of many of the programs during the presidency of AMLO in Mexico, the most recent past president, as it concerns people lifted out of poverty. What have we learned? What do we know? And how did they achieve the results they achieved?
Yeah, so this really is excellent news. López Obrador, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, was the first left-wing president of Mexico, arguably since Cárdenas, Lázaro Cárdenas in the 1930s, the famous president who nationalized the oil industry. And he was president from 2018 to 2024. So now we have the numbers on whether his programs and whether his approach actually worked. And turns out it did. They did. According to the autonomous federal agency in Mexico called INEGI, as you see here on the screen, 13.4 million Mexicans were lifted out of poverty over AMLO's 6-year term. And let's, recall that in the context of that, there was a little thing called the pandemic, inflation problems and, the supply chain crisis around the world. So this is truly an extraordinary achievement that the INEGI has reported. And I think it's important to discuss how we got there, actually, because it's not just the headline number of the 13.4 million, but also 2 million people escaped extreme poverty, which is the hardest poverty to attack, because we're not just talking about urban poor in the capital who are kind of closer to reach, but indigenous women in the countryside, in the southern part of the country, where we saw the numbers improve significantly. So it was a combination of factors. We've talked about in this show, I think on previous appearances, AMLO's basket of social programs, the universal senior pension, stay-in-school scholarships for young people, aid to single mothers, a disability pension, basically a basic build-out of a welfare state, right? That, never existed or existed in a clientelist way, right? A way for the PRI to maintain its hegemony over 70 years in Mexico. There was also the program Sembrando Vida, or Planting Life, which is a tree planting and husbandry program. Young People Building the Future, Jóvenes Construyendo el Futuro, which is a paid apprenticeship program. So, there were the social programs, and that was important. But it's interesting that the report pointed out that it wasn't just the social programs alone, but also rising wages. And I think that's really important to point out, right? That it wasn't just putting all the eggs in the basket of social programs. The minimum wage went up over 100%. It had a long way to go because wages had been deliberately suppressed in Mexico for 3 decades. So the minimum wage increase had a knock-on effect on other wages and also union contracts that were tied to the minimum wage increases. So wage increases were so important. And then one other thing there, which I think is important to point out, a raft of legislation that helped workers, right? So we're talking about domestic workers being required to have their employers sign them up with the Social Security system. The outsourcing reform, which prohibits companies from outsourcing the essential functions of a company. And so people had to get on the official payroll, which then meant that they were eligible for benefits and profit sharing and that whole raft of benefits. Trade union reform, simplifying the process for creating new unions, secret ballots for union elections, renegotiation of contracts, a new series of labor tribunals, a doubling of vacation days, and also what just recently passed was the Uber law, which was what was tried and failed in California, which is to classify rideshare drivers as official employees if they hit a certain number of hours worked. Which, of course, Uber fought against, but lost in this case. Mexico was the first country in the world to regulate the status of rideshare drivers. So the idea is to build out a welfare state, but not only in the kind of the traditional categories of work that we see, but also extend it to people like domestic workers, rideshare drivers, independent journalists, in my case, right? And that's a way to kind of recognize the changing nature of work as well.
I mean, I think it's fantastic. And I'm curious how, before we get to some of the more negative news, as Eugene said, well, how did Mexico manage to sort of buck the neoliberal consensus while much of the rest of the region remains trapped in austerity?
Part of it is Mexico went through the worst. It went through total shock therapy, right? From 1982 on, Mexico went through what they call the long neoliberal night, which includes 2 drastic devaluations of the peso in 1982 and 1994. An IMF intervention requiring, structural adjustments, and we all know what structural adjustments mean. Basically, a privatization and a hollowing out of the state, and that's from everything from airlines to electricity production to mining to the banks. The Mexican public over time, it was like the shock doctrine on steroids. Became inured to the neoliberal message because they saw where it led to. They saw that it led to violence, poverty, the encroachment of cartels, because when you hollow out the state, you create a space for the cartels to then provide services that the state isn't providing. So people saw where that leads to, and it leads to a very dark place. And also a lot of credit has to be given to the Mexican public. It's a very politicized public. It's a very organized public. And this is a public that's been organizing for decades to get to where it is. We're talking about, just to give a very brief review, the 1968 student movement and the massacre in Tlatelolco. We're talking about the fights through the 70s to break open what was then the one-party state of the PRI, the 1988 electoral fraud with Cuauhtemoc Cárdenas, the founding of the then PRD, what was called the martyrs of the PRD. Hundreds of people were killed, right, with that center-left party at the time trying to gain ground. Then there was the electoral fraud of 2006 and AMLO's first run, the student movement of 2012, the Yo Soy 132 student movement. So it's been decades and decades of real groundwork to get here. These things don't just come from benevolent elites deciding that they're going to be nice one day. It comes from, grassroots pressure, as we know from around the world, and that's what happened in Mexico.
Mm-hmm. Well, to move to some of the other news, I mean, obviously, I think people probably have seen, the U.S., well, going really back to the Trump campaign, this idea of Mexico as a so-called narco state and the need for the United States to have some sort of military intervention against the, quote unquote cartels. And I think, there's been a lot of rhetoric around this, but there's been seemingly intensified preparations by the United States to potentially take some sort of unilateral military measure. I mean, what do we know about this, and how serious does it seem that this could move out of the realm of rhetoric and into the realm of reality?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? On our program on Mexico's Channel 11, Canal 11, Sin Muros, we kind of have the maxim, we don't want to overstate what Trump's doing because that plays into his hand, right? Or understate it. We always try to be right in that fine point, right, of the analysis, right with what's going on without playing into his rhetoric or kind of discarding it. In this case, we have two recent reports, one from Rolling Stone magazine and one from Ken Klippenstein, which says that there is actually a serious push to create plans to attack Mexico, right? And that they're drawing up a package of targets right now. That the original idea was to do kind of a soft invasion back in November, with the latest executive order from Trump directing, the armed forces to go after the cartels. Remember, a few months ago, Trump declared a number of cartels in Latin America's FTOs, foreign terrorist organizations. Coincidentally, they were all in Mexico or Venezuela. So with this latest executive order, according to these reports, the ante has been upped, and that they are preparing a list of targets that would go after high-value targets, in their terms, or supply chain people or installations, facilities where cartels are supposedly hidden. Now, of course, we've seen all of this rhetoric before, that we're just going to do targeted surgical strikes. We're just going to go in and we're just going to go after the bad guys. We know exactly what happens when the United States even talks about starting to drop bombs on a country. We're talking about, civilian deaths. We're talking about increased migration flows. We're talking about, actually an increasing of cartel activity as it simply spread out into other areas, and probably the threat of reciprocal attacks by cartels within U.S. territory. I mean, it would be an absolute and utter disaster, and not to mention the protests that would come from the Mexican people, both in Mexico and in the United States, the 37 million people of Mexican descent in the United States, shutdowns of maquiladoras, factories, the economic implications that would have, just the fact that they're even flirting with the idea. And we see, on the screen, just in the last few days, Trump is sending armed carriers down, 4,000 Marines, spy planes. There have been increased flights of drones over Mexican territory in conjunction with the Mexican government, but you always wonder how much they're being bludgeoned into it in the context of, current negotiations about the tariff threat. So, I think a lot of it is psychological warfare. I think they want to gain advantage against Mexico in the current tariff negotiations. They want Mexico to give more ground. They're in another 90-day holding period on the tariffs. And I think their goal is, in large part, to try to gain more concessions at the table without, actually doing the strikes. But there are just enough crazy people in the Trump administration that you just have to keep it in mind, right? Terry Cole, the new DEA director, hates Mexico. I mean, he's one of those anti-Mexico hawks, and there are plenty of them in the Trump administration. So that's why you always, again, have to be on that fine point of the analysis. It's very difficult. We don't want to do PR for Trump, and we don't want Mexico to overreact and give preventative concessions. They have to hold strong at the negotiating table. But also, this is also a time where, civil society organizations and religious organizations and Latino organizations and, others, anti-imperialist organizations, this would be a great time for all organizations to be raising their voice to say, no attacks against Mexico, no attacks against Venezuela, no attacks against Latin America or the Caribbean, period.
Yeah, I mean, let's talk about that for a moment. Why is Mexico such a threat? I mean, we just talked about lifting all these people out of poverty, all of these amazing markers of success. Yet all you see in the US media about Mexico and the corporate media is stories about how horrible this Mexican government is and how horrible AMLO was. And look what they're doing to the judiciary. And then what you see from the American government, especially now under Trump, is this desire to literally get militarily involved against Mexico under the auspices of fighting drug cartels. But what is all this really about? What's this hostility about?
Part of it is just out and out racism. This idea that Mexico is a backward, violent country, right? And, that is a hard set stereotype that's very hard to, unlodge. Part of it is as simple as that. But, there are other factors here. It's the classic schizophrenia with regards to U.S. foreign policy in Latin America. The U.S. says it's against migration. It wants these countries to stand on their own 2 feet and blah, 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 the whole discourse that we know. But at the same time has spent decades intervening in these countries, meddling in these countries' internal affairs, cooing them, supporting, the worst of the worst, and actually training the worst of the worst at the School of the Americas in Fort Benning, Georgia, in order to insert them back into their countries to do horrific damage in these countries. So, what do they want? They don't want migration, but they also don't want Mexico to be a successful modern country either. They want Mexico to be under their thumb. And you can't have it both ways. You can't say you're against migration and then do everything possible to undermine Mexico's path to modernity on its own terms. And that's what this really boils down to. The 2 most controversial acts by López Obrador, certainly in the eyes of the U.S. One of them was the electric industry law a few years back, which brought the electric grid back under public control, which of course had implications for multinational energy countries, both Spanish and American, which wanted to cannibalize the Mexican grid for its own purposes. And of course, the same drive to create more autonomy for Mexico's national oil industry. And then that was extended to the nationalizing of lithium in 2022. Mexico's got significant lithium stores, which obviously are important for a whole raft of new technologies. The lithium has been nationalized, and it's in Sonora, dangerously close to the US border. So there's that. The other big thing here was the national security law, where AMLO's administration created limits for the actions of U.S. intelligence agencies on Mexican soil with regards to, not being able to carry arms like in the past, not be able to participate in joint operations as in the past, having to report to Mexican authorities with regards to their actions, share intelligence, whatever else. The DEA was furious about that, furious. They were used to having Mexico as their own backyard, their own play yard there, right? And they were furious at that, and then started leaking furiously against AMLO for that reason. That's why you saw these rafts of supposed news stories during last year's presidential campaign that AMLO's presidential campaigns had maybe been tied to drug trafficking, although they never proved anything, or that the Morena party was tied to drug trafficking, although they never proved anything. Those were filtered directly from the DEA into a very pliant U.S. press. So, it's the intelligence agencies. When they don't get what they want, they start leaking or, undermining.
Well, a lot to watch and a lot to keep watching, and we will continue to follow it. And if you want to follow it on a more regular basis, I suggest you become a regular listener to Sobre Rania, the Mexican politics podcast, of which you, Kurt Hackbarth, are a host. As always, Kurt, really appreciate you. Thanks so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you remember how Trump was like, peace through strength?
Yeah. Well, we're about to see what happens there. And I mean, Kurt mentioned it. We've got the activation of the U.S. Forces there in the so-called Southern Caribbean, roaming the Caribbean Sea. I mean, there's 2 Iwo Jima-class assault ships, 4,000 Marines with the Marine Expeditionary Unit that have been there. I mean, a lot of it seems to be aimed at bullying and threatening and perhaps even doing more to Venezuela, who, of course, has been in the crosshairs, but also Mexico, of course, could potentially be in the crosshairs. Any country really in the region. I mean, let's not forget Trump Trump saying he's going to take control of the Panama Canal. And I think that's what's important in a way, Rania, because this is being sort of portrayed by the Trump administration as part of their broader, anti-cartel, anti-drug, blah, blah, blah networks. But, these Iwo Jima class assault ships, the Marine Expeditionary Unit, the way they work together are actually units that are designed to invade countries. I mean, they're designed to do amphibious invasions, to clear the ground either for larger, deeper, broader invasions, like you think about the people who kind of go on the ground first, prepare the beachhead, all those different sorts of things, or to do some sort of surgical strike designed to take out a leader, to kidnap a leader, to do something of that nature. So this is actually a regime change type of instrument. I mean, some might say it in a different way, but that's essentially what these people are for. The Marine Expeditionary Units, that's their entire existence, is to be able to deploy very quickly to engage in hostilities with other nations. And same thing with these amphibious class assault ships. So this is a military operation here that is being put out. And, the U.S. knows that other countries are aware of this, and that this is the threat, and that this is what's happening. So whether it's a threat, whether it's bullying, whatever it may be, I think it's just showing that this is significant escalation by the United States aimed at, multiple Latin American countries, it seems.
Yeah, it's just, at some point, does this empire ever just get stretched too thin, Eugene? Like, how many it can't be infinite. Maybe it is. Maybe it is. I just feel like at some point, how can you be everywhere all at once without something having to give?
Yeah, well, that's U.S. imperialism, right? Everything, everywhere, all at once. That's the nature of. They say that they want to be able to fight two major wars at the same time, a major war in Europe and a major war in Asia. So sort of that World War II mentality. But this is why we have such a huge military-industrial complex. That's why there are, hundreds of thousands of soldiers. If you consider the reserves and the National Guard, over 1 million. That's why there's, I think, 11 or 12 aircraft carrier battle groups now. Things that it's so outrageous, the size of the U.S. military, the 190 bases around the world, that it's just the only way you can describe it is exactly what you said. It's a military that's built for world domination, that the entire reason for existence, the amount of money they spend, the $1 trillion every year, is designed to actually be everywhere and to be able to wage multiple large-scale wars. Like when they say they want to be able to fight two wars on two fronts, they're talking about a war against China and a war against Russia. So then if you sort of draw that back to sort of smaller scale conflicts, then they're really sort of structuring themselves to be able to wage, 15 to 20 different smaller scale conflicts at any given time, or 5 to 6 larger regional scale conflicts. And of course, as the Biden administration used to always say, that was also the importance of all of the different quote unquote alliances, and that the U.S. sort of projected its power through an articulation of its alliances around the world. So you have AUKUS, you have NATO, you have all these various different things that they have going on, to where they can also rope in and bring under the command of U.S. forces, like the South Korean military, by the way, which is in a wartime situation would be taken over by the United States. So that they can also add that as manpower and as weaponry and other things to continue to force project. So it's really a massive, huge imperial system. Winston Churchill and others used to say that the sun never sets on the British Empire, and that's, I think, the same concept that the United States is bringing to the table. So it's really, really quite the situation.
It really is. And Eugene, I know before we wrap here, I know you wanted to talk a bit about some developments in Mali. So go at it.
Thank you, Rania. Just a few things. We have to find time to talk about it more at a different time. But there, many people may have seen there was now couple weeks ago, actually maybe it was last week, is middle of August, but I'm losing track of my days, that there was a lot of reporting around an attempted coup in Mali, how a number of generals were arrested, other officers were arrested, and some French citizens were arrested, and the sort of implication there being that this could potentially be a French plot to overthrow the government of Mali. But it's now become wrapped up in a number of different affairs. You've got, 2 former prime ministers who are being held on charges potentially of corruption, that's also going on. And you can see the sort of broader Western media, and if you read about it in, say, The Guardian, so-called progressive media, it's all being portrayed as that Mali, and by extension Burkina Faso and Niger, are engaged in this massive crackdown against democracy and civil society inside of the country, and that these events are all a part of this crackdown on society, the end of democracy, the military dictatorships, and all of these other things, and sort of suggesting that it might be, that it's sort of a little bit outrageous to suggest that there could be some sort of coup, especially one sponsored by France. And I think that it's important for people to understand what's happening here is that this is a part of a broader, huge propaganda campaign against the Alliance of Sahel states, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, that are coming together more closely, building a Pan-African vision, and bringing in very different projects that are actually really starting to push back and overthrow the nature of neo-colonialism in Africa in general, but specifically in what was called France-Afrique. And let's remind people here that France said for many years, many different people, the specific quote is attributed to many different people, that without Africa, France has no future. And in fact, the entire French post-World War II strategy has been heavily based on the maintenance of a neo-colonial version of the former French Empire in Africa as a critical component of France's ability to maintain its power as a major power in the broader geopolitical scheme of things after the end of World War II. So this is not just some fantasy that has existed here. I mean, this is actually French strategy. Even as recently as last year, you had the French School of Strategic Warfare put out a study, and it's closely linked to the French government, the French intelligence, about the need to fight Pan-Africanism on the African continent because it was undermining French economic prospects in Africa, the total exploitation of the African continent. And these countries in the Alliance of Sahel states, it's important to put, what you're hearing about, oh, well, they're totally against democracy and they're having this big crackdown, alongside what's actually really happening. I mean, you look at a country like Mali that also in the past few days has just recently made an announcement that they're actually giving out 22,000 tons of free grain. They are giving out, I think, over 10,000 tons or something of that nature. Maybe it's pounds instead of tons, but I'm getting there correctly there, of subsidized rice. So they're making a big push there. And they're spending tens of millions of dollars to irrigate tens of thousands of hectares of land to help build food sovereignty. So they're actually helping in countries that are some of the poorest countries on earth, people to just be able to survive without hunger by spending money on providing immediate food aid to their own people, while also making sure that they are spending the money to build the infrastructure. They also are just engaging in a huge 100 million euro project to build the roads. So they're also irrigating the land. They're promoting small scale agriculture. They're building out the roads and the transportation systems. They're supporting marketing. In fact, they've just also spent more money on improving the telecom infrastructure, access to the internet, access to electricity. I mean, all these things are happening. And how are they paying for all this, you might ask? Well, the way they're paying for all this is they're actually starting to collect back taxes on mining companies that have been evading taxes. So some of the biggest mining companies on earth, from Canada, from Europe, from the United States, from Australia, that have been exploiting Africa for years in almost every part of the continent and evading taxes. I've actually lost count of the exact number, but they've collected over $500 million in back taxes. They also, and this is in Mali alone, they also in Mali have raised and changed the laws to give the government greater shares in the mining companies so that they're getting more of the money from their own resources. And in fact, one of the largest gold mines in Mali just reopened very recently, so they'll be getting more money than they would have been in the past that they can then put into these programs. They're also reserving more ownership of mining companies for local investors who, of course, will also then have to pay taxes, but it's still another way to build the local wealth of a country like Mali. And so they're taking these hundreds of millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of euro, they're taking and putting it back into building out agriculture so they can have food sovereignty, building out road infrastructure, building out electricity infrastructure. And also, when you look at the issue of former political elites and prime ministers being held to account, this is in countries where these sorts of elites are never held to account for anything. They are working hand in glove 9 times out of 10 with these international mining corporations to loot their own country. They themselves get very rich and live in the whatever arrondissement in Paris in their big giant mansions, while the majority of their people go hungry and struggle to live and have unemployment and these massive crises that are caused because of it. And so when they're talking about there's a crackdown on democracy, to many people in the Sahel, this is the opposite. This is real democracy. The mining companies are being held responsible. The officials are being held responsible. No one is above the law in the way that it used to be. And hundreds of millions of dollars is coming into the coffers of the government and being redirected towards social programs that people want to see. I was in Niger last year, and I'll close on this. And someone made this point at a conference I was at. They took the mic. They said, my entire life, every 5 years we vote. And when the election comes, they say we're going to build hospitals, roads, and schools. And then we never build hospitals, roads, and schools. And so he said, to great applause, he said, so rather than being worried about voting, why don't we just build the hospitals, roads, and in schools. That's what I want the government to do. And I think for the Western mindset, that's hard to hear because we're brought into this whole kind of bourgeois democracy. But elections like this in countries like Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso have done nothing. And in fact, they've only entrenched people who have further impoverished the country. So you hear about this anti-democratic this, that, and the third. I think you should really think twice, because when we look at what's happening in terms of the actual social transformations that are going on in the Alliance of Sahel states, the way they're bringing the Pan-African dream alive once again here in the 21st century, I think it's a very different story than what you see in the mainstream media.
Well, I'm glad we have you here to tell it to us, Eugene. And we're definitely going to keep covering this and everything else happening in the Sahel. Before we wrap here, Eugene, I just want to remind our viewers that in addition to liking, subscribing, and sharing this episode, which helps boost us in the algorithm that seems to hate us, you can help support Breakthrough News by going to patreon.com/Breakthrough News and becoming a member for as little as $5 a month, where you can access exclusive content as well as exclusive merch. Also, you can make sure to follow everything we produce, because I don't know if YouTube is telling you when it comes out. So I don't know if you understand the new theme of my complaints on this program, Eugene, are against YouTube throttling us. I'm not going to let this go. You know how Karen I get. I want to talk to a goddamn manager.
You would like to speak to a manager.
Yes. Any YouTube manager, please.
Yes.
Let's fix this. Come on. Come on,
Indeed.
guys.
Well, it's an honor. It's a pleasure to be back alongside you, Rania. A pleasure to be back with our audience, and we will be back with you again on the freedom side next week. So for myself, for Rania, for the Breakthrough News team, we will see you next time.